British parliamentary format. The basics are that there's 4 teams per round: opening government, opening opposition, closing government, and closing opposition. And there's 2 speakers on each team. So the government teams, opening government and closing government, have to defend the motion and argue in its favor and explain why it's a good idea, whereas opening opposition and closing opposition need to oppose the motion and explain why it's a bad idea. If you're doing a 3v3 debate, then the government team, since there's only 1 team, just argues why the motion is a good idea, whereas the opposition team argues why it's a bad idea. You will get 15 minutes of prep time to come up with arguments, and each speech lasts 5 minutes. Don't speak more than 15 minutes, 5 minutes and 15 seconds, because the judge will stop tracking your speech at that point. The next thing to note is points of information, which is something that you may not have come across before. Between the first and the 4th minutes, so the first and last minutes are protected time, but other than that, members of the opposite team can offer points of information. So if you are on the opposition and a proposition speaker is currently giving their speech, then you can say point of information by interrupting verbally or by raising it in the chat, and the speaker can either accept or reject your point of information. A point of information is essentially a question or a brief rebuttal that you want the opposition speaker to respond to. So it should be very short and snappy. Don't make it long-winded, because it needs to be short to be effective, and you need to wait to be accepted before speaking. Also, it's not a back and forth discussion, so you shouldn't ask your point of information and then once the speaker responds, come back with another rebuttal to that. You should just ask 1 question and then sit down. And make sure that you wait a few seconds before asking again if you are rejected. And so once you accept that point of information, they'll ask a question, you respond, and then you move on with the rest of your speech. So this is what a British parliamentary debate would look like. You have opening government with the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister, opening opposition with the Leader of Opposition and Deputy Leader of Opposition, and then the closing government and closing opposition teams with member of government, member of opposition, and government whip and opposition whip. And the speaking order is as follows, as demonstrated by the arrows. If you were doing a 3v3 debate, then you would just take this government whip and just add him on to the government bench here. So you'd have the Prime Minister and then the Leader of Opposition, and then the Deputy Prime Minister and the Deputy Leader of Opposition, and then the government whip and the opposition whip. Very similar to the format that we did yesterday when we did the 3v3 debate. So then I'll just move on to explaining the speaker roles. The Prime Minister introduces the definitions and the framework for the debate. So this is just explaining particular terms or keywords in the motion and explaining what they mean, and identifying what you think is important in the debate. Secondly, you want to introduce the exact policy or the model and explain what exactly it is that you'll be doing. So if it was this House would implement a quota for women in politics, then you would want to outline what exact percentage would you use and what the exact details of your policy would be. And finally, introduce the case of the government and present your first 1 or 2 arguments. The leader of opposition does the exact same, except for the opposite side. So you introduce your counter proposal or counter policy. So instead of what the government is doing, what would you rather do? And then respond to the previous points and make your own points for the opposition. The second speakers, or the deputy speakers, respond to the previous points made by the speaker on the opposite side. And then secondly, the unique job that they have is to rebuild the case of their first speaker. Because undoubtedly, your first speaker made points that were responded to by the other side. And so you need to deal with those responses to make sure that your first speaker's arguments are still standing. So you need to explain why those responses don't hold, or explain why actually it only dealt with part of the argument and this whole other argument is still standing. That's what you should be doing. And finally, bring forward a new argument. If you have one, this is not necessary, but if you do, that's obviously beneficial. And generally explain why your side is beating the other side. The Deputy Leader of Opposition does the exact same thing, except in the opposite side. Now for the closing half teams, the member of government and the member of opposition, who are the first speakers for the closing teams, their job is to provide an extension. And this is an important part of British parliamentary, that the opening government and the closing government teams, or the opening opposition and the closing opposition teams, even though they're on the same bench and they're technically on the same side, they're not working together. And actually, it's your job as the closing team to explain why your arguments and your extension material are more important than what your opening team has already said. So you want to demonstrate why your arguments actually matter a lot more than what your opening team's already said. So that's your job, and on the next page, I'll demonstrate what exactly an extension is. But the second speakers, or the whip speakers, generally need to summarize the debate in a biased adjudication of sorts. So you want to go through the debate, explain what arguments were said, and generally try to demonstrate why your side is winning. And you want to then respond to the arguments made by the other teams in the round. Also weigh against your opening and explain why your team's contribution matters more than what your opening team has already said. But you shouldn't have new substantives, so you shouldn't run entirely new arguments or new analysis. You just need to summarize the debate, respond to the arguments, and demonstrate why your team is winning. So extensions. What counts as an extension? And this is really only applicable if we do British parliamentary format. An entirely new argument, of course, counts as extension material, but even if you don't have that, new rebuttal, so dealing with the arguments made by the opposition in new ways, or new analysis, where you present the same argument but give new reasons as to why it might be true, those all count as new material. Anything new that meaningfully contributes to the debate and strengthens your side standing in defeating the opposition, all of that counts as new material. So the next thing is proposition fiat. What is proposition fiat? This is the simple notion that the policy being proposed is assumed to successfully pass through legislation. So what I mean by that is, if the motion was this House would implement a sugar tax, you can't, as the opposition, say, this would never happen. Realistically, politicians would never agree to this, because that's just going to make the debate unfeasible. You need to assume that the policy will pass and then discuss, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? However, at the same time, proposition can't assume that everyone will react happily. It's still legitimate for the opposition to say, look, we accept this policy will pass, but we think it'll make certain people very unhappy, and then demonstrate why that might be harmful in turn. Now, just briefly on definitions. This is especially relevant for the first speakers, who will mainly define the debate and explain what the debate's about. Generally, they should just be as broad as possible, because we want debates to be interesting. We want to discuss the widest variety of scenarios that could occur. So there's no sense in limiting the debate to a particular scope in any way. So as a general rule, you aren't allowed to place set the debate or time set the debate. So you can't say this debate will only happen in the US, or it will only happen in a particular city or a particular place at all. And you also can't time set the debate by saying it'll happen at a particular period of time. So it's not legitimate to say, no, this policy is not good because of the COVID pandemic, because you need to assume a normal time period where there's nothing unusual exactly, unless the motion specifically calls for it. So if the motion was specifically talking about a particular country or a particular time period, then of course you need to discuss what happened in that time period. The next thing is counter proposals. So as I mentioned before, the opposition side can have a counter policy, because the proposition has proposition fiat, so they're getting the ability to pass whatever policy they want, and they're passing, let's say, a sugar tax. The opposition can say, hey, look, you have this political influence to pass a sugar tax. If you can do that, then instead what we want to do is provide subsidies for healthy food, for example. So you can, as the opposition, pass any counter policy that you would like, but they do need to follow certain rules. So it does need to be stated in the first opposition speech. That's only fair to give the proposition side enough time to react to your stance. Secondly, it needs to be mutually exclusive to the other side. So there's no sense in proposing a policy that proposition can just stand up and say, actually, we can do that too. So you do need to explain why it's the case that proposition can't also do that policy. One of the ways that you might do that is to say, look, there's only so much political influence and leverage that you have. So if you're passing a sugar tax, you can't also provide subsidies and and spend all this money since this money is limited. So either you pass a sugar tax or you provide subsidies. It's one or the other. And finally, the counter proposal shouldn't take up more resources than the proposition policy. So if proposition says we're going to pass a sugar tax to make people eat more healthy, then opposition can't say, actually, no, we don't want a sugar tax, we're just going to cure cancer. Because obviously curing cancer requires far more resources and time than passing a sugar tax. And it's only fair that you implement a policy that takes up as much or less resources than what the proposition is asking. So the final thing I'll just discuss is the types of motions. There's a few types of motions. The first and the simplest that you'll come across is this House would, such as this House would implement a sugar tax. All this means is that the proposition is passing a particular policy using a particular model, which is the exact implementation of that policy. So as the proposition, you should identify what the problem is that you're trying to address, outline what exactly you're going to do to address it, and then justify and explain why that's going to be likely to be successful in solving that problem. And as the opposition, you just want to put a spanner in the works and explain why that policy is not good, why it's not going to be effective, and why it's going to harm the issues that that proposition deems to be important. The second type is this House believes that, or this House supports. These are analysis motions, and they're very similar to the House would motions in the sense that proposition is, again, standing for a particular policy, and opposition is going to argue why that policy is bad. But the key difference is that proposition can't specifically outline the exact way that they would like that policy to happen in the same way that they can for this House would. Instead, they need to justify and outline what the most likely way that policy is going to happen is. So as an example, one of the motions that I've done in the past is this House believes that comedians from minority communities should not base their comedy on stereotypes and slurs about their own groups. And the important thing is that neither the proposition or the opposition can say exactly how comedians will use their comedy and exactly what kind of comedy it'll be, whether it'll be offensive, whether it'll be constructive and try to break down stereotypes. You can't say. What you can argue is justify and give reasons to explain why one scenario is more likely than the other, and then explain whether that's good or bad. The third type is this House regrets or this House supports. Again, the proposition will argue for a particular thing and argue why it's good, and opposition will argue otherwise. But the key thing is that this is a retrospective debate. So you need to justify and explain what would have happened had this particular thing not happened. So for this House regrets the decline of religion, for example, you need to justify on proposition and opposition what would have happened had religion not declined. What would the world look like? And justify it such that there's two worlds, a counterfactual and the present world. And then you explain what's more likely and which one's better. So those are the basics of the format that we'll be doing. Are there any questions about any of that?